So Chapter 2, Video 2, we're still looking at the colonies and the reasons why people settled along the East Coast, these English settlers here. We had just talked about the southern colonies, Jamestown, Virginia, and Maryland, forming in order to make money, and we said that we would be comparing them with the New England colonies, which will be settled by Puritans. So the first of these will be Plymouth, and it was settled by separatists. These were people from England who felt that the Church of England was too Catholic for their tastes, and they, because of their beliefs, they were persecuted in England, and so they're going to come over here on the Mayflower, led by William Bradford. They come over here as pilgrims to start a new life for themselves where they could practice their religion the way they saw fit. And they will settle this colony of Plymouth in what will be Massachusetts. Before they get off the Mayflower, they're going to write something called the Mayflower Compact, which established the kind of government that they wanted in this colony, and it was going to be a government of the people, where the male members of the community, incidentally church members of the community, were going to govern themselves. And this was a new kind of government, unlike anything really going on in the world at the time. It will be this group of pilgrims that you learned about when you were young. You might have seen the movie Squanto, who will teach them a lot of the ways to get along in this new world. These will be the folks to have the first Thanksgiving, and so forth. So you're familiar with these ideas of pilgrims, if only from Schoolhouse Rock or something like that. There will also be Massachusetts Bay Colony formed. King Charles I will give them a charter, and the folks settling here will be led by John Winthrop. They will come over on board a ship called the Arabella, and they very consciously were basing their colony on religion and on Puritan beliefs. Even in the early writings aboard the Arabella, we see them talking about that this colony shall be a city upon a hill, an example of a Christian-based government and society for the rest of the world to see. Also in this area, we're going to see the formation of a colony called Rhode Island. And this will form from a different way. There was a man named Roger Williams who was living in the Puritan colonies, and he disagreed with some of the Puritan teachings. Now, these Puritans had come over for freedom of religion, but it was freedom of religion for what they believed, and they expected everyone to follow what they believed. And Roger Williams didn't. In fact, he said something that I think is very descriptive. He said, "Forced worship stinks in God's nostrils." He didn't like that the Puritans expected everybody to believe according to their teachings. He believed in a more individualized form of belief. And so he was banished by the Puritans in Massachusetts. He was supposed to go back to England, but he doesn't. He's going to buy some land from Native Americans, and he's going to establish a colony at Providence, which will become part of Rhode Island. And Providence was to have freedom of religion. We'll also see Anne Hutchinson, the wife of a wealthy merchant with a ridiculous number of children, who started to have sort of almost a Sunday school or a Bible study in her home where she would talk about her religious beliefs. And that was seen as okay until she started to say that God had spoken to her. And these Puritans just could not believe that such a thing would occur. And certainly that God would speak to a woman. And so then she got in trouble, and she was to stand trial, and she held her own pretty well on the stand until she mentioned God speaking to her. It wasn't even just that God had spoken to her individually or that she was a woman, but she said that God was telling her that the Puritan ministers were wrong. And so, of course, the Puritan ministers weren't going to stand for that. She also was sent out of the Puritan colonies, and she will go to Roger Williams to stay for a little bit, and then she'll kind of branch off and form the colony of Portsmouth, which will become part of Rhode Island as well. Now, a few years later, she and her entire family were massacred by Native Americans, and I would assume that the Puritans back in Massachusetts just kind of said, that's what you get, right? So the Puritans are still gaining a lot of people over here. A lot of settlers are coming over and settling in these colonies, and they need to expand. And we see the colony of Connecticut basically forming as sort of Puritan suburbs as the Puritans are moving out from Massachusetts and spreading out. So these are other New England colonies. We have a colony formed at New Haven, and New Haven will be absorbed into Connecticut. There was a colony at New Hampshire and one in the area that now is Maine that will also be, kind of the Puritan suburbs as Puritanism was spreading. Now, as far as southern colonies, we've already talked about Virginia and Maryland, but coming on down from there, there was the colony of Carolina that had been settled south of Virginia. The northern part was not very successful because they didn't really settle near the harbor or port. But in the southern part of Carolina, there was a colony at Charlestown, what now is, of course, Charleston, where they were using the port. And so that is going to be a much more successful place. And these two colonies, I'm sorry, this one colony will split into two colonies in 1719 and become North and South Carolina. Then as we come further south, we of course have Georgia. King George II is going to give the charter for Georgia, and James Oglethorpe is going to found a colony at Savannah in 1733. Now, Georgia was designed to be both a penal colony for when the prisons get full in England. Some of the prisoners were sent over here and dumped here. It also was to serve as a bit of a buffer colony from between Spanish Florida and the other English colonies to the north of Georgia. Georgia is going to be settled by a number of different immigrant groups. James Oglethorpe did not like slavery, and so he had certain rules. You were not supposed to have rum, you were not supposed to have slaves, and you were not supposed to have any estates or farms larger than 500 acres, because he thought that if you had a farm bigger than that, then you would want to have slavery. He, of course, will not live forever, and so after he dies, the rules will change in Georgia, and we certainly will see larger estates and we'll see slavery develop. Now, the other colonies are called the middle colonies. So we're looking at between New England and the southern colonies, you have these middle colonies, or sometimes what's referred to as the mid-Atlantic colonies. So one is New York. The Dutch had sent a man named Henry Hudson over to explore the area, and he is going to settle the area for the Dutch. The Dutch will set up posts on what now is Manhattan, and a Dutch leader named Peter Minuit is going to buy Manhattan from the Native Americans for a pretty good deal. But the British aren't going to like the Dutch being there, and they will attack. The Dutch leader Peter Stuyvesant is not going to really be able to rally the Dutch forces to fight off the British, and so the British will take over this colony of New York. Where it had been called New Amsterdam while the Dutch controlled it, it will become New York because the Duke of York will be given the region. Then we'll see the settlement of a colony at New Jersey. The Duke of York was given that land to start a colony. And the Dutch will settle in part of this area. The Puritans will settle in part of the area. There will be Scots in part of the area as well. So it will be an example of a diverse colony, certainly. And then you have, as another middle colony, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn. He will start the colony in part because the King of England owed him money, and so he'll get the colony instead of the money. But he will bring a number of different people, different religious groups, over to Pennsylvania to settle. You'll see Quakers and Mennonites and the Amish, and some other groups from Europe, because Pennsylvania, what William Penn had in mind for Pennsylvania was a colony with true freedom of religion and tolerance for all. They wanted law and order without the use of oaths. They didn't want any wars, and they wanted true freedom of belief. And that will continue in the colony of Pennsylvania.